Good. Okay. I'm going to give a shout out to the place where I bought my book. So they're not paying me. I'm just shouting out to them. They were really nice people. It was a good deal on the book. I don't know, maybe that's backwards. I don't know if you're going to read it. But anyways, it's in New Orleans. It's a bookstore in New Orleans, so it's my bookmarker. All right, today we're going to read chapter 2. Excuse me. Chapter 2 of the quartet. The financier and the prodigy.
Hi.
You are sure to be censured by malevolent critics and bug riders who will abuse you while you are serving them and wound your character in nameless pamphlets, thereby resembling those little dirty stinking insects that attack us only in the dark, disturbing our repose, molesting and wounding us while our sweat and blood is contributing to their subsistence. Benjamin Franklin to Robert Morris, July 26, 1781.
I thought you wanted to clear on that tree, I'm Joe.
If anyone harbored the hope that the recently ratified articles would function as a viable American government, that hope was exposed as an illusion in the first year of its existence. The most glaring problem was attendance. At the first session of the Continental Congress, it was decided that 9 states constituted a quorum, with 2 delegates necessary for a state to qualify as present. But on multiple occasions throughout the spring and summer of 1781, no official business could be done because 5 or more state delegations were either absent altogether or only partially represented. Part of the problem lay with the state legislatures, which were often slow to select their delegates. Part of the problem was that the leading candidates refused to serve, preferring to perform their public duties at the state level. John Witherspoon of New Jersey became the most frequent and vocal critic of this sorry situation, waiting around with nothing to do because his erstwhile colleagues had failed to show up. But the attendance problem accurately reflected the political priorities of the most prominent American leaders. In truth, it would be misleading to say that local and state concerns trumped the national interest, because in most minds no such thing as the national interest even existed. A second source of systematic malfunction was the coordination of foreign policy. All business came from the full Congress, an unwieldy arrangement at best, rendered most maddeningly chaotic because the membership of state delegations kept changing. When Arthur Lee joined the Virginia delegation, for example, his inveterate suspicion of Benjamin Franklin's ties to the French court Lee, it soon became clear, was suspicious of everyone, especially non-Virginians, split the Virginia vote almost every foreign policy issue, essentially negating the largest state's voice. In the late spring of 1781, word arrived in Philadelphia of some grand European conclave led by France, Russia, and Austria that purportedly intended to put an end to the war and impose a peace based on the current status of forces. Diplomats cited the venerable doctrine of uti possidetis, loosely translated as keep what you currently control, which at the moment meant the British could claim parts of New York and Virginia as well as the Carolinas and Georgia, where all in all there were still 25,000 British troops on the ground. Nothing came of this typically imperious European initiative, and the Confederation Congress ought not be blamed for the communication problem posed by the Atlantic Ocean. But the political reality was that there was no decisive American presence in the foreign policy conversation apart from the peace negotiations in Paris, who at least officially took their orders from Congress. A third problem that emerged early was the resolution of the Western land disputes, which had been festering for several years. Although the states claiming land in the region west of the Alleghanies had been required to cede their claims to the Confederation Congress upon admission into the Union, many of the landed states, especially Virginia, insisted on their right to determine the borders of their cessions, and also on the revocation of all Indian treaties signed by the land companies within the so-called domain. The question at issue was whether the states or the Congress possessed ultimate authority to resolve the disputes. The clearest argument for congressional authority came from John Witherspoon. He observed that Great Britain had acquired a vast tract from the Alleghanies to the Mississippi in 1763 by winning the French and Indian War. Then the United States acquired the same territory by winning the war against Great Britain. This controversy, the War for Independence, was begun and carried on by the united and joint efforts of the 13 states. By their joint exertions, and not by any one state, the dominion of Great Britain was broken, and consequently the rights claimed and exercised by the Crown devolved on all, and not any individual state. This meant that the Western lands were a national domain effectively held in trust by the Union of states created under the Articles. This argument made logical and legal sense to almost everyone except the Virginians, who were accustomed to thinking of the Old Dominion as an empire of its own, with the Ohio Valley and Kentucky as extensions of Greater Virginia. Even James Madison, the most non-provincial member of the Virginia delegation, felt obliged to defend his state's claim to Kentucky's borders, though he opposed the threat of the Virginia legislature to revoke its previous cession. Intriguingly, he wrote to his new friend Thomas Jefferson that Virginia's recalcitrance on the Kentucky question had best end soon, since he presumed that the present Union will get little survive the present war.
I'm gonna shut that flush off, Joe.
Although the Western lands would eventually prove to be a treasure trove that helped to create a collective interest among the states, at the onset, arguments over its management had just the opposite impact, exposing fault lines still existing between the landed and landless states, and the lack of any common history in thinking nationally rather than as sovereign states. Vermont was hardly a part of the Western domain, but arguments over its petition for admission as a state dominated deliberations of Congress throughout 1781. What was originally called the New Hampshire Grants included land that these three states, New York, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, claimed as their jurisdiction, producing interstate bickering that the Congress could not resolve. Meanwhile, Pierce Butler of South Carolina regarded Vermont's petition for statehood as a power play by the New England states to enhance their influence in the Congress, a malevolent move by the Northern interest, contrary to the Southern interest, by which the sectional balance will be quite destroyed if the Confederation Congress was intended to function as a political platform where all the states came together to address their common interests. The Vermont question seemed uniquely designed to expose their mutual jealousies and suspicions. Vermont statehood was held hostage to these state and sectional hostilities for the duration of the Confederation. But the most serious problems facing the not-so-united states, more ominous than all the others put together, was the ballooning debt. Under the Continental Congress, the main source of revenue was the printing press, meaning that Congress mass-produced paper money in the form of dollars called continentals. It also issued what is called certificates, which were promissory notes given to merchants and farmers as payment for food and clothing needed by the Continental Army. In short, apart from French loans, the entire fiscal policy of the Continental Congress was based on a massive hoax, which resembled what today would be called a Ponzi scheme. There was nothing to back the Continentals and certificates because the annual request for money from the states, called requisitions, had become laughably plaintive pleas that the state legislatures, with debts of their own to pay, simply ignored. In 1781, for example, the Congress requested $30 million from the states and received $39,138 in return. A standing joke within Congress was that the binding requisitions are as binding as religion is upon the consciences of wicked men. Unable to coerce the states to pay their annual tax bill, since coercion smacked of Parliament's infamous Stamp Act, which had started all the trouble, in 1780 the Congress proposed what was called an impost as an alternative source of revenue. The impost placed a 5% duty on all imports, in effect an indirect tax, or perhaps a tax by another name. But once again, the ghosts of the American Revolution haunted the conversation, since the impost was a domestic version of the Townshend Act, 1767, which the colonists had opposed as an overly clever way to tax them without their consent. For obvious reasons, the impost was controversial, and when the articles went into effect, no vote on it had yet been taken, because the articles contained a clause prohibiting the Congress from raising revenue. Passage of the impost required the equivalent of a constitutional amendment, which meant unanimous approval by all the states, a near impossibility. Somehow, the full implications of the fiscal crisis facing the government had been conveniently obscured before the articles were ratified. At least the correspondence of the delegates to the new Confederation Congress registered a genuine sense of shock upon realizing that the exchange rate for the Continental had fallen to 500 to 1, meaning that it was essentially worthless. They had also inherited a federal debt of between 30 million and 40 million, swelling each month because of interest payments. The president of the Congress, Samuel Huntington, sent a circular letter to the states in May 1781, apprising them that our northern army is starving, and there was no way for the Congress to raise funds for their relief unless the states paid their requisitions in full. That was not going to happen. The unimaginable and until now unspeakable implication was that all those ardent and heartfelt soliloquies to virtue and the cause were in the process of evaporating before the sordid reality of American bankruptcy. It was entirely possible that the war for independence could be lost because the American government was broke and was configured in such a way that rendered any resolution of the problem impossible. If there was no structural solution to the fiscal problem, indeed the state-based structure of the articles of the core of the problem, the only possible answer was personal leadership. That is, find the right man, vest him with the requisite authority, then trust his judgment to balance the books and rescue the cause and the Continental Army from disintegration. There was only one man eligible for this desperate mission who happened to be the wealthiest man in America. His credentials were entirely financial, meaning that he was a latecomer to the movement for independence. but he was an acknowledged genius at reading account books, understanding markets, and winning the trust of his creditors. For all these conspicuous talents, he had acquired the nickname the financier. He was also shrewd enough to realize that rescuing America's fiscal policy was from insolvency was a thankless task no sane man would ever assume, a reluctance that rendered him even more attractive. His name was Robert Morris. For several reasons, Morris did not want the job. As he wrote in his diary soon after receiving the offer, a vigorous execution of the duties must inevitably expose me to the resentment of disappointed and designing men and to the calumny and detraction of the envious and malicious. I am therefore absolutely determined not to engage in so arduous an undertaking. He was probably remembered his career service on what was called the Secret Committee of the Continental Congress, where he and Benjamin Franklin had orchestrated a series of covert negotiations with French suppliers to provide arms, food, and equipment for the Continental Army. Because France was still a neutral nation at the time, all those dealings were clandestine and exposed Morris to the charge, groundless it turned out, of profiteering at the public expense. He was a big man in all senses, physically, economically, and socially in Philadelphia, and so was a conspicuous target for newspaper editorials questioning his integrity as a merchant whose profits came at public expense. Benjamin Franklin knew firsthand that all the accusations were misguided, that in fact Morris had actually used his own credit to underwrite loans that rescued the Continental Army from starvation in the early years of the war, probably losing more money than he made in the process. Writing from Paris, Franklin urged Morris to assume the responsibility for directing American fiscal policy, all the while realizing that no matter how well Morris performed, his decisions would be criticized and his very character vilified. You are sure to be censured by malevolent critics and bug writers who will abuse you whilst you are serving them and wound your character in nameless pamphlets, thereby resembling those little dirty stinking insects that attack us only in the dark, disturbing our repose, molesting and wounding us while our sweat and blood is contributing to their subsistence. No good deed, in short, would go unpunished. Morris brooded for 4 months before accepting the job of Superintendent of Finance in May 1781. Pressed by all my friends, acquaintances, and fellow citizens, he explained, and still more by the absolute necessity of a change in our money system, I have yielded and taken a load to my shoulder. He knew what he was up against because he possessed a clear vision of what was needed to restore public credit, and an equally clear recognition that what needed to be done collided head-on with the state-based political structure of the Articles. The majority of delegates in the Congress initially welcomed Morris as the Messiah and granted him unprecedented powers to deliver them from the financial abyss. Morris realized from the start that he would need to lead them in a direction that most delegates and most Americans were unprepared to go. Much like Franklin's, Morris's biography was an opening scene in which a teenage boy arrives in Philadelphia with little more than his wits and the clothes on his back, and 20 years later has become the most prominent, in Morris's case the wealthiest, citizen of the city. A century before the Horatio Alger story of rag to riches took hold in American mythology, Morris lived that story to perfection. Unlike Franklin, Morris was an immigrant born in Liverpool in 1734, the son of a merchant and a woman, Elizabeth Murfett, who disappeared from his life soon after delivering him into this world. His father migrated to the eastern shore of Maryland soon thereafter, pursuing his vocation as a tobacco merchant. In 1747, he brought his son over to join him, but parental duties apparently bored him or conflicted with his mercantile aspirations, so the 13-year-old Morris was sent to Philadelphia to serve as an apprentice with a shipping firm headed by Charles Willing. 8 years later, in 1757, at the tender age of 21, Morris was made a full partner in Willing, Morris and Company, the largest and most lucrative mercantile house in Philadelphia. How that sudden surge happened is not fully recoverable, but young Morris, who had no formal education and showed little interest in books, apparently possessed an uncanny instinct for the way markets work. For example, when Willing was away on business, Morris learned that a drought in Europe had created a market for flour, and on his own, he purchased all the available wheat crop in eastern Pennsylvania, which when sold as flour in Paris and Madrid yielded huge profits. Under his canny eye, the company tripled the size of its shipping fleet, established agents in all the European capitals and throughout the West Indies, and made Morris a very rich man. He cut quite a figure in Philadelphia society in the 1760s, tall, slightly over 6 feet, with a Celtic complexion and pale blue eyes. In 1763, his sexual ramblings produced an illegitimate daughter whom he supported financially until she married. He never forgot his impoverished origins. Walking the wharves, he knew most of the workers on the first-name basis, and he did much of his business with a wine-glass in hand at City Tavern, where the bartenders and waiters relished his arrival and the huge tips that always followed. In 1769, he married Mary White, who came from the prominent Maryland family and built a baronial estate called the Hills just outside the city for his family, which eventually included 7 children. Morris supported the protests against the Stamp Act, but, much like Washington, left the political theorizing to others. Although it hurt his business, he supported the non-importation agreements as a more effective form of protest than constitutional arguments. Appointed to the Continental Congress in 1775, he sided with the moderate faction led by John Dickinson, which sought, as Morris put it, to procure accommodations on terms consistent with our just claims. By the spring of 1776, as the prospects for reconciliation dissolved, he grudgingly embraced the inevitability of American independence. He absented himself from the vote for independence on July 2nd, explaining that the war would prove ruinous for both sides. But then he signed the declaration on August 2nd, probably the most reluctant signer in the Congress. He then threw his full energies and his matchless list of European and West Indian contacts into the procurement of arms and equipment for the Continental Army. He came under criticism for mixing his own private accounts with public trades, thereby making a profit on the war. But the awkward truth was that Morris's credit in the international marketplace was a kind of gold standard that enhanced the purchasing power of the American government. Most of the money his firm made during the war came from the fleet of privateers he outfitted that captured British cargoes in the Atlantic and Caribbean, which Morris regarded as a splendid example of patriotism and profit in one seamless package. When he accepted the call to put America's financial house in order, he was 47 years old. The portrait painted by Charles Willson Peale about that time reveals a man comfortable with himself, with the customary accoutrements of middle age on display, a receding hairline, expanding girth. In addition to an enormous fortune, he brought 2 convictions to the task at hand. First, a firm belief that patriotism and its intellectual accomplice, virtue, were less effective motivating forces than interest. And second, an answer to the question everyone was asking, what will hold the states together once the war ends? Washington believed the answer was the Western domain. Morris believed the answer was debt. He also brought a way of thinking about money that did not yet have a name. The term capitalism did not appear until 1850. The key concept in this emerging mentality was credit, a word derived from the Latin credere, meaning to believe. Credit refers not just to the money you possess, but also to what others believe you will be able to pay. One economist was described credit as money of the mind, which focuses attention on the psychological dimension of a capitalistic marketplace. When Morris gave his note to a customer in Madrid or Kingston, for example, he seldom had the cash on hand to pay for the purchase, but he could make the trade because the customer believed he would eventually make good on his promise. When one of his many ships delivered his cargo somewhere else in Europe or the West Indies, credit multiplies the amount of money in circulation, thereby giving the capitalistic economy greater productive potential while making it vulnerable to endemic bubbles. When projections prove illusionary, credit collapses and market adjustments take the form of a depression. Morris was able to avoid the fate by adroitly juggling his expenses and his sales, and by making Willing, Morris and Company into a de facto bank with cash reserves that allowed him to survive the inevitable cargo lost at sea. All this became strikingly relevant when the financier took command of the American economy, for Morris's way of thinking was terra incognita for most Southern delegates in Congress, especially Virginians, who still regarded land, not money, as the ultimate measure of wealth, and for whom the manipulation of numbers on a balance sheet came across as some sinister form of magic, eerily similar to the calculations their English and Scottish creditors were employing to drive them into bankruptcy. At the public level, Morse's chief task was to restore the credit of the United States government. Actually, restore is not right, since nothing had existed beforehand to be restored. He faced some pressing problems that required immediate attention, chiefly the deplorable condition of the Continental Army. But his main task, as he saw it, was to establish the credit of the Confederation as a whole, as if it were a unified fiscal entity. His initial impulse was to think about his goal in personal terms, bringing his own reputation to the rescue of the Republic. My personal credit, which thank heaven I have preserved through all the tempests of the war, has been substituted for that which the country had lost. He wrote to the governor of Virginia, I am now striving to transfer that credit to the public. There was also an implicit but deeply nationalistic motive in his mission, namely to persuade the marketplace, meaning the European bankers and governments, that the United States was fully capable of honoring its foreign and domestic debts and becoming a reliable presence in the global economy. For a man who was on record as doubting the wisdom of the war for independence, it was a bold transition from a reluctant patriot to an ardent nationalist. But he had made his living and an enormous fortune anticipating before anyone else where the market was headed, and he brought the same confidence in his judgment about the marketplace in the political arena, where nothing less than American destiny was the crucial question. He was accustomed to making all or nothing wagers in his business and almost always winning the bet. He carried the same confident mentality into his new role as custodian of the unforeseen implications of the American Revolution. Morris's first act as America's financier was to announce the creation of the Bank of the United States. Since most Americans did not know what a bank was, Morris published an explanation in the Pennsylvania Packet. He described the bank modestly capitalized at 400,000, with shares selling at $400. As a first step in the direction of national solvency, I need to render this bank, excuse me, I need to render this bank a principal pillar of American credit so as to obtain the money of individuals for the benefit of the Union and thereby bind those individuals more strongly to the general cause by ties of private interest. Left unsaid was Morse's assumption that he was overseeing the national economy and that the bank was an institution embodiment of that fiscal reality. He began sending a series of circular letters to the states in which he apprised the governors that the annual requisitions were mandatory obligations, not charitable requests, as to the complaint made by the people of a want of money to pay their taxes. He observed, "It is nothing new to me, nor indeed to anybody. The complaint is, I believe, quite as old as taxation itself, and will last as long." All of a sudden, there was a decisive presence in charge of fiscal policy, declaring that the days of mounting debt and routinized recalcitrance were over. It is high time to relieve ourselves from the infamy we have already sustained and to rescue and restore the public credit, he lectured. This can only be done by solid revenue. We may be as happy or miserable as we please. He also launched an all-out campaign for passage of the impost, the equivalent of a national tax, which for substantive and symbolic reasons was the acid test of the union's viability. He apprised the governors that all the European bankers were watching the vote on the impost, and if it failed, they would plausibly conclude that we are unworthy of confidence and that our union is a rope of sand, that the people are weary of Congress, and that the representative states are determined to reject its authority. The fact that the vote had to be unanimous was obviously a political challenge, all the more reason that the state had to speak with a single voice, since the impost was an essential instrument in paying off the debt they all shared together. Upon entering office, Morse had announced that his eye was focused on the long-term health of the American economy and that he therefore was not going to divert funds to pay the Army. However sensible this decision was fiscally, it soon proved politically and even morally untenable. Letters from Nathanael Greene, who was commanding slightly more than 1,000 troops in South Carolina, described men who were literally starving to death, walking around in loincloths. And then Washington apprised Morris that a provincial version of the perfect storm was occurring, that the French fleet had sailed up from the West Indies to the Chesapeake, just as the British Army under General Cornwallis, 7,700 strong, had placed itself on the Yorktown Peninsula. There was now an opportunity to trap and capture the largest British force on the continent, but Washington lacked the resources to move the Continental Army and its invaluable French allies from New York down to Virginia. Morse wrote personal checks to provide rations and clothing for Greene's troops and to cover the costs of Washington's Yorktown campaign, believing that he would recover his losses when a cargo of silver from France arrived in Boston the following month. This was the kind of juggling act that he had practiced and perfected as America's premier merchant, now deployed to assure success in what proved to be the culminating battle of the war. Within a few short months, Morse had made himself the most powerful figure in American government, second only to Washington as a national leader. In August 1781, at the same time he was signing a check to fund the Yorktown campaign, He drafted a comprehensive financial plan that synthesized his thinking about the reforms necessary to move the American economy from bankruptcy to solvency. The plan included the national bank, the impost, a land tax, a poll tax, an excise tax on whiskey, plus the assumption of state debts by the Confederation Congress. It was a financial blueprint for a fully national economy, almost identical to the plan that Alexander Hamilton would propose a decade later. Morris was at the peak of his power, and he felt it. I can obtain whatever is wanted for the public service by a script of the pen, he boasted. Benjamin Rush concurred, calling Morris a new star in our American hemisphere. This could not last, for Morris was attempting on his own to impose a national economic architecture on a political foundation that vested sovereignty in the states. Arthur Lee, whose ideological antennae were poised to detect any stirrings in the political atmosphere that disrupted his keen sense of Republican purity, regarded Morris's financial reforms as a second coming of George III. The accumulation of offices in this man, the number of valuable appointments in his gift, the absolute control given him over all revenue officers, his money and his art, Lee lamented, rendered him a most dangerous man to the liberty of this country. Lee's appetite for personal vendettas was voracious, and he now shifted his sights from Franklin to Morris, rising in Congress to question Morris's apparently limitless power, eventually publishing a series of articles in the Freeman's Journal attacking Morris's character. In fine, sir, is not the disbursement of $8 million annually in contracts, Lee asked rhetorically. It's not the profit and influence arising from this. It's not the hourly offerings of incense and adulation from surrounding parasites, sufficient to satiate your vanity, pride, and avarice. Even though Morris was spending substantial sums of his own money to subsidize the army, Lee accused him of profiteering at the expense of the public, casting a shadow over Morris's reputation that, no matter how misguided, never completely disappeared. Meanwhile, just as Morris's relentless campaign on behalf of the impost seemed successful, even 11 of the necessary 13 states had ratified. A change in the Rhode Island delegation created an impasse. The new member was David Howe, a former mathematics teacher at Rhode Island College, later Brown, who shared Lee's hostile attitude towards Morris and held some pure Whig political convictions of his own with theological fervor. Howe acknowledged that his opposition to the impost was partly economic, chiefly the fact that the duties proposed would fall disproportionately on the maritime states like Rhode Island. But more menacingly, the impost violated a core revolutionary principle enshrined in the Articles, namely the sovereignty of the states, making them instead mere provinces of Congress and tending to the establishment of an aristocratical or monarchical government. Indeed, Howe described the Confederation Congress as a foreign government and the impost an updated version of the Townshend Acts. Rhode Island had a long-standing tradition of independence that sometimes verged on eccentricity, and following Howe's lead, the legislature voted unanimously to reject the impost in November 1782. Morris was stunned, insisting that he was acting in accord with Article 8 of the Articles of Confederation, which granted Congress the authority to raise revenue from the states and thereby create a common treasury to pay for the war. He dispatched a 3-man delegation to make his point to the Rhode Island legislature. But before the delegation could reach Providence, word arrived that Virginia had changed its mind and revoked its ratification of the impost. How this happened never found its way into the historical record. Through the murky shadow of Arthur Lee hovers behind the scenes. The death of the impost marked the end of Morse's swashbuckling phase as financier. Despite his relentless circulars to the states, the revenue acquired by requisition remained only a fraction of what was required. I am so habituated to receive apologies instead of money, he explained to one governor, that I am never surprised if complaints of difficulties were equivalent to cash. I should not complain. But that is not the case. To make matters worse, his personal fortune suffered when the British Navy, in reaction to the Yorktown disaster, decided to shut down American shipping all along the Atlantic coast, in the process scooping up the lion's share of Morse's fleet. What I had afloat has all been lost, he explained to a friend. Requesting a loan, then adding with a touch of the Morris wit that the amount of that loss I will forbear to mention, as there might be in it an appearance of ostentation. While no treaty ending the war had yet been signed, and there was a firm consensus in the Congress as well as in the all-important mind of George Washington that one more campaign would be required to break the British will for good, out there in the countryside there was a conspicuous decline in support for a war that was all but over, and support for Morse's fiscal policy declined as a consequence, because the driving force for national unity had always been the war for independence, not any larger sense of the collective interest. In a confidential letter, Morse even acknowledged that he harbored a secret hope that the war would not end. But was I to confine myself to the language of a patriot, I should tell you that a continuance of the war is necessary until our Confederation is more strongly knit, until a sense of obligation to support it shall be generally diffused among all ranks of American citizens. This might strike us as an odd argument, but it is followed naturally from the widespread conviction that the primary motive for an American Union had been winning the war, and that once the motive was removed from the political equation, the Union ended and only a loose confederation of states remained. What then happened to the Confederation was anyone's guess. The youngest member of the Virginia delegation, who styled himself James Madison, Jr., believed it did not bode well if our voluminous and entangled acts be not put into some certain course of settlement before a foreign war is off our hands, he warned. It is easy to see they must prove an exuberant and formidable source of intestine dissensions. Madison almost preternaturally shy and the second youngest delegation in Congress, had become one of Morse's staunchest and most effective supporters. In some respect, he remained a loyal Virginian, for instance, voting against the Bank of the United States, since Virginia regarded all banks as mysterious places where you sent your money to disappear. But Madison possessed a meticulous mind that liked to digest and assimilate evidence and experience in the deliberative style of a scholar, or once he made up his mind, like a lawyer defending his client. In 1782, he was still making up his mind, evolving towards his eventual role as next to Washington, Virginia's preeminent nationalist. I think that's a good stopping point for today. We're not going to get all of chapter 2 done. That's been almost 44-minute read. I'm not a very fast reader. I thank everybody for joining me. We'll finish chapter 2, the financier and the prodigy, at another time, another date. So thank you all very much for joining me on my book reading, and I will see you all again, and we'll read some more. We'll read some more later. Okay. All right. Thank you. I'll put my bookmark in there. Don't forget, check them out. And if you're ever in New Orleans, check out the uh, check out the bookstore. All right, bye bye. Good night.